On the morning of December 19, 1907, the Darr mine in Westmoreland County opened as it always had. Lanterns were lit. Lunch pails were checked. Men descended into the earth in small groups, their silhouettes swallowed one by the narrow mouth of the shaft. Above ground, the day was cold but unremarkable, winter settling into the hills without warning of what would follow. By mid-afternoon, something was wrong. Before we begin, drop a comment with your location and the time you're watching. We love seeing where these stories reach. The first sign was not an explosion, not smoke, not noise, but delay. The shift that should have begun returning to the surface did not appear. Foremen checked their watches. Another 15 minutes passed, then 30. No signal came from below. The hoist stood idle, its cables slack, as if waiting for instructions that never arrived. A strange quiet settled over the site. Those who worked the mines understood silence. Underground labor was punctuated by constant sound, tools striking stone, voices echoing through tunnels, the distant rumble of carts. When that sound stopped entirely, it meant something had interrupted the rhythm in a way no schedule accounted for. Supervisors attempted to lower a message canister. It returned untouched. When the first rescue team descended, they reported debris in the upper passages, but nothing catastrophic. No clear blast zone. No obvious collapse large enough to explain the sudden loss of contact. Air readings fluctuated unpredictably. Some tunnels felt unusually cold. Others carried a heavy stillness that made breathing difficult. Then the rescuers reached a junction where the mine no longer behaved like the map said it should. Passages that were marked open narrowed abruptly. Familiar routes ended without explanation. Sound carried strangely, returning distorted, as though the tunnels had shifted in subtle ways. The team withdrew, shaken but unable to articulate why. By nightfall, families had gathered near the entrance. Wives and children waited for news that did not come. The company issued a brief statement acknowledging an incident underground and promising further information. No cause was given. No numbers were confirmed. Over the following days, reports began to diverge. Some accounts spoke of an explosion. Others insisted there had been none. Official tallies changed repeatedly. Names appeared, disappeared, then reappeared in lists posted near the mine office. A few men were confirmed dead. Others were missing, their whereabouts unrecorded. What troubled later investigators most was not the scale of the tragedy, though it was immense, but the uncertainty that followed. Sections of the mine were sealed quickly before full searches could be completed. Testimonies conflicted. Company records and government reports failed to align. The Darr mine disaster would later be cited as one of the deadliest in American history. Yet even as its name entered public memory, key details slipped away. Not all bodies were recovered. Not all questions were answered. And beneath the hills of Westmoreland County, the mine fell silent, holding secrets that official explanations never fully reached. To understand why the disaster at the Darr mine could slip so quickly into uncertainty, it helps to understand Pennsylvania as it stood in 1907. Coal was not simply an industry. It was the foundation of entire communities. Towns existed because of the mines, and when the mines faltered, so did everything above them. Westmoreland County was dotted with company-owned houses, company stores, and company doctors. Many miners were recent immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, men who spoke little English and relied on the mine operators not only for wages, but for housing and food. Complaints were risky. Questions were discouraged. Work continued even when conditions were known to be dangerous. Safety regulations existed, but enforcement was inconsistent. Inspections were often announced in advance. Records were handwritten, fragmented, and sometimes altered to protect company interests. Accidents happened frequently enough that only the largest disasters attracted sustained attention, and even then, the narrative was usually shaped by those who owned the mines. The Darr mine was considered productive, not safe. It ran deep, with a complex web of tunnels expanded rapidly to meet demand. Maps were updated irregularly. Some passages were worked, abandoned, then re-entered years later with little documentation. Old shafts were sealed hastily, sometimes without notation, creating pockets of instability underground. Miners understood this. They spoke quietly of dead air, of tunnels that felt wrong, of sections best avoided even when supervisors insisted otherwise. Gas explosions were an ever-present fear, but so were collapses caused by overstressed supports or forgotten voids beneath the rock. In the days after December 19, outside investigators struggled to piece together what had happened. Company officials suggested a gas explosion, but evidence was inconsistent. Some areas showed blast damage, others did not. Survivors described being thrown by force in one tunnel, while men in adjacent passages reported only a sudden pressure change and darkness. The isolation of the miners compounded the confusion. Many families could not read the notices posted by the company. Names were misspelled or translated incorrectly. Some men worked under aliases or nicknames, further muddying records. As a result, even determining who had been underground that day proved difficult. This was the environment in which the disaster unfolded, a place where danger was normalized, documentation was fragile, and truth was often negotiated after the fact. When the mine went silent, it did so in a system already accustomed to losing clarity. And that made it possible, for reasons still debated, to seal sections of the Darr mine before anyone fully understood what lay beyond them. Before the disaster, the men who worked the Darr mine lived with an understanding that danger was constant, but uneven. Some days passed without incident. Others left scars that never healed. The mine decided which was which, often without warning. Most of the miners were immigrants or first-generation Americans. They came from Hungary, Italy, Slovakia, and Poland, drawn by steady wages and the promise of work that did not depend on the weather. Their names appear inconsistently in company records, sometimes anglicized, sometimes misspelled, sometimes replaced entirely by numbers assigned at hiring. They worked long shifts in narrow seams, often hunched, often in near darkness. Lantern light revealed only a few feet of tunnel at a time. Beyond that, the mine existed as sound and instinct. The creak of supports, the distant rumble of carts, the subtle change in air that signaled danger before instruments ever did. Families learned to read these signs secondhand. Wives listened for changes in routine. Children counted the minutes after shifts were supposed to end. Silence was never neutral. Several men who descended the mine on December 19 were considered experienced. They had worked those tunnels for years and knew which passages to trust. Others were new, assigned to sections they had not yet memorized. According to later testimony, at least one crew had expressed concern that morning about ventilation in a lower section. The concern was noted and ignored. When the disaster occurred, survival depended less on proximity to the blast and more on location. Some tunnels absorbed the force, others funneled it. Men closer to the center of damage were sometimes spared, while those farther away were overcome by gas or collapse. Rescuers later found pockets where miners had survived the initial event, barricading themselves behind debris, rationing air and light. A few were brought out alive days later, disoriented and unable to explain exactly what had happened around them. Others were never found. Families waiting above ground clung to rumors. Someone had heard tapping. Someone else had seen a light move deep underground. Lists posted near the mine office changed daily. A man marked dead one day appeared alive the next. Another vanished from the list without explanation. As days turned into weeks, hope thinned unevenly. Some families received bodies to bury. Others received only silence. Officials spoke of inaccessible sections, of gas levels too high for continued search, of risks that could not be justified. It was then that certain tunnels were sealed. The decision was framed as necessary. But for those who watched the entrances close, the timing felt abrupt. Searches had not concluded, names had not been resolved, and beneath the hills, the mine remained vast enough to hold more than the records ever admitted. In the days following the initial rescue efforts, investigators tried to reconstruct the final hours before the mine fell silent. Their task was complicated by the fact that no two accounts matched completely. What one foreman described as a minor gas ignition, another called a pressure wave. A survivor insisted there had been no blast at all, only a sudden rush of air, followed by darkness and confusion. Several miners recalled faint tremors earlier that morning. Not strong enough to stop work, but noticeable enough to raise concern. Tools rattled briefly. Dust drifted from overhead supports. One man later testified that the ground beneath his feet felt alive, shifting in small, uneven movements before settling again. Gas inspectors reported irregular readings in the hours before the disaster. Pockets of methane appeared where ventilation should have cleared them. In some tunnels, air seemed to stagnate for no clear reason, yet production continued. Shutting down a mine was expensive, and uncertainty rarely justified interruption. When rescue teams first descended after the disaster, they encountered scenes that defied expectation. Some passages were choked with debris, as anticipated. Others were nearly untouched, their supports intact, tools still resting where men had left them. In a few areas, lanterns were found extinguished but unbroken, as though the air itself had simply vanished. Communication between rescue teams and the surface proved unreliable. Signals were delayed or lost entirely. One team reported hearing voices echoing faintly through a side passage, only to find the tunnel ended abruptly in a collapse that appeared older than the disaster itself. Company officials released statements suggesting a single cause, a gas explosion, but internal notes, later uncovered, tell a more uncertain story. Engineers disagreed on where the explosion originated. Some could not agree that there had been an explosion at all. As pressure mounted to recover bodies, a difficult calculation emerged. The deeper sections of the mine were unstable. Gas levels fluctuated unpredictably. Each descent risked adding rescuers to the casualty list. After several close calls, the decision was made to suspend searches in the most dangerous areas. Families were told that all reasonable efforts had been exhausted. Yet the maps used to justify these decisions were incomplete. Several passages shown as sealed or collapsed had not been physically verified. Others were missing entirely from official diagrams, their existence known only to the men who had worked them. When the first tunnel entrances were sealed, it was done quietly. No ceremony, no public explanation. Wooden barriers went up, followed by stone and earth. What lay beyond was officially designated inaccessible. For some families, that word carried finality. For others, it sounded like evasion. As the weeks passed, rescue efforts slowed, then fractured. Officially, teams were still being dispatched, but their range grew narrower with each descent. Entire sections of the mine were now considered too unstable to enter. Gas readings fluctuated wildly, sometimes spiking without warning, sometimes dropping to levels that suggested open air where none should have existed. This inconsistency unsettled even veteran rescuers. One team reported entering a passage that appeared structurally sound, only to find the air unnaturally cold and thin. Their lantern flames burned low despite fresh oxygen tanks. They retreated quickly, later noting that the tunnel did not behave like any they had worked before. It felt sealed and open at the same time. Above ground, the mine company faced growing pressure. Newspapers demanded answers. Families demanded names. Government inspectors arrived, but their authority was limited. Much of what they were shown came filtered through company officials, who emphasized danger, instability, and the need to prevent further loss of life. Quietly, a different process began. Engineers reviewed the underground layout and marked certain areas for permanent closure. These decisions were framed as safety measures, but they carried another consequence. Once sealed, those tunnels would never be searched again. Any men beyond them would remain unaccounted for. Lists of the dead were revised. Numbers fluctuated. Some men were declared deceased without bodies recovered based on last known positions underground. Others remained listed as missing, their status unresolved. The distinction mattered deeply to families, but it blurred quickly in official summaries. One widow later recalled being told that her husband was presumed lost, a phrase she did not understand at the time. It meant there would be no further search, no remains, no certainty. Rumors spread through the community. Some claimed that tapping had been heard days after sections were sealed. Others spoke of lights seen deep in abandoned tunnels. These stories were dismissed publicly, but they persisted in private conversations, passed from family to family. By early January, the mine entrance itself became quieter. Crowds thinned. Journalists moved on. The company issued a final statement declaring the recovery phase complete. What remained was an absence that did not resolve cleanly. Men had gone into the Darr mine on December 19, 1907. Some were brought out. Some were buried. And some, according to the records, simply disappeared into a space that was closed before anyone could be sure what still remained inside. In the months that followed, the Darr mine became a place defined as much by what was left unexplored as by what had been uncovered. Official explanations settled into a familiar pattern: gas ignition, poor ventilation, unavoidable tragedy. These accounts were repeated often enough to gain authority, even as details within them shifted quietly from one report to the next. Survivors who had been pulled from the mine alive offered accounts that complicated this narrative. Several described sudden changes in air pressure that did not match a single blast. One miner said the force felt directional, as though something had moved through the tunnels rather than exploding within them. Another recalled hearing a deep, rolling sound moments before everything went dark, a sound he compared to stone grinding against stone. Rescue teams, interviewed later, spoke cautiously about what they encountered underground. Some tunnels appeared altered in ways that did not align with collapse patterns. Passages narrowed unexpectedly. Familiar junctions seemed displaced by several feet. One rescuer stated that a tunnel he had mapped years earlier no longer connected where it should have, as though the interior layout had shifted. Company engineers dismissed these claims as confusion brought on by smoke, darkness, and trauma. Yet internal correspondence reveals uncertainty even among specialists. One engineer wrote that the mine's deeper sections had been overextended beyond reliable mapping, a phrase that suggested more than simple negligence. Government records from the period offer little clarity. Inspection reports contradict one another on key points: where the initial event occurred, how far it traveled, and how many men were likely beyond reach when the first seals went up. Some documents list areas as cleared, that others describe as untouched. This inconsistency fed public unease. Local residents began to speak of the mine in hushed terms, not as a grave but as a place unfinished. Farmers living above the tunnels reported strange settling in their fields months after the disaster. Cracks appeared in the ground where none had been before. These incidents were attributed to natural subsidence, but their timing raised questions. Families of the missing continued to write letters. Many went unanswered. A few received responses that repeated the same phrases: conditions unsafe, all efforts exhausted, no further recovery possible. None addressed specific names. By the end of 1908, the Darr mine had largely faded from headlines. Coal production shifted elsewhere. The site itself was partially abandoned, its entrances reinforced, its deeper sections sealed permanently. Yet the story refused to settle, because for all the explanations offered, no one could say with confidence what had happened in the furthest reaches of the mine, or how many men had been there when the silence fell. As official attention moved away from the Darr mine, a different record began to form, one made up of personal accounts, family recollections, and details that never entered government reports. These fragments did not agree on everything, but they shared a persistent theme: the sense that the disaster had not fully revealed itself. Several families insisted their relatives had survived the initial event. They pointed to evidence that contradicted the final tallies: miners known to be stationed in areas later described as intact, Men experienced enough to recognize danger early, workers who had survived worse incidents in the past. Yet their names appeared among the unrecovered, quietly folded into the final count without further explanation. One particularly troubling claim came from a rescuer who spoke years later, long after the mine had been sealed. He described entering a section officially listed as searched and finding tools arranged neatly along a wall, as though a work shift had ended normally. There were no bodies, no signs of panic, no indication that the men who had been there realized disaster was imminent. Why those miners were never found remained unanswered. Company officials maintained that inaccessible tunnels explained the discrepancy, but maps from the period show entire networks of passages that were never fully explored after the disaster. Some were marked simply as unstable, without further detail. Others vanished from updated diagrams altogether. Local folklore began to fill the gaps left by official silence. Stories circulated of men hearing knocking beneath the ground months after the mine closed. Others claimed lantern light could be seen deep within sealed shafts, flickering briefly before disappearing. These accounts were dismissed publicly, but they endured privately, passed down within families. Historians examining the case decades later noted that the Darr mine disaster occurred during a transitional period in mining oversight. Regulations were tightening, but enforcement lagged behind. Companies were under pressure to minimize liability, while governments lacked the tools to compel transparency. In such an environment, ambiguity could persist unchecked. What stands out is not that the disaster was deadly, many mines were, but that its aftermath resisted closure. The numbers never quite settled, the maps never aligned, and the sealed sections were never reopened, even when technology improved enough to make it possible. The mine remained underground, intact and inaccessible, holding whatever answers it still contained. And for those who lost family members that day, the question was never simply how they died. It was whether the full truth had ever been brought back to the surface at all. By the time winter returned to Westmoreland County, the Darr mine existed in two forms at once. Above ground, it was quiet. Abandoned structures, locked gates, warning signs posted where families once gathered. Below ground, it remained a vast, unmapped interior that no longer answered to schedules, inspections, or oversight. Later reconstructions of the mine's layout revealed just how complex it had become by 1907. Years of rapid expansion had produced overlapping tunnels, temporary shafts turned permanent, and older passages re-entered without proper documentation. In some places, new routes had been cut dangerously close to abandoned voids, creating thin barriers of rock that could fail without warning. Rescuers working after the disaster spoke of this confusion openly. They described reaching junctions that were not marked on any map, where air flowed in directions that made no sense. One team reported finding a wall that had not collapsed but appeared to have shifted inward, narrowing the passage until it could no longer be entered. The rock face was smooth, not jagged, as though pressure had been applied slowly rather than violently. This raised an unsettling possibility that some sections of the mine had not collapsed suddenly, but closed gradually, sealing off pockets of space while leaving few visible signs. Official reports avoided this interpretation. They favored explanations that fit known hazards: gas, fire, structural failure. Yet none of those explanations fully accounted for why certain areas remained intact but unreachable, or why equipment and personal belongings were found in places where no bodies were ever recovered. Families were not allowed to view the sealed sections. When they asked why recovery could not continue, they were told conditions remained too dangerous. The explanation never changed, even years later, when similar mines were reopened using improved methods. Some historians later suggested that the company had strong incentives to limit exploration. Every unrecovered body represented potential liability, unanswered questions, and scrutiny that could expose long-standing safety violations. Sealing tunnels solved many problems at once: practical, legal, and reputational. Yet this explanation, too, feels incomplete, because even among those who accepted the official narrative, there remained quiet doubts. Doubts rooted in survivor testimony, in altered maps, in the strange consistency with which certain areas resisted access. Doubts reinforced by the fact that some names never appeared in final death lists at all. By the end of that winter, the Darr mine disaster was officially closed. But underground, the mine itself remained unfinished, its deepest sections untouched, its final moments undocumented, its silence carrying questions no report could seal away. In the years immediately following the disaster, attempts were made to fix the Darr mine into a single, settled explanation. Official summaries described it as a tragic but understandable event, an accident born of gas, poor ventilation, and the risks inherent to early 20th century mining. These explanations were repeated often enough to become familiar, even comforting in their simplicity. But the records themselves resisted that simplicity. Government documents from 1908 and 1909 disagree on basic facts. Some list the initial cause as an explosion. Others avoid naming a cause at all. Diagrams included in these reports contradict one another on the location of the deepest damage. A tunnel described as collapsed in one document appears intact in another, without explanation for the discrepancy. Most striking is what the records do not say. There is no comprehensive list of sealed sections, no final map showing what was searched and what was not. Instead, references appear in passing: inaccessible area, unsafe for entry, beyond recovery scope. These phrases recur, but they never point to the same locations. Local officials deferred responsibility to the company. The company deferred to the inspectors. Inspectors cited conditions underground. Responsibility dissolved into procedure. Meanwhile, families continued to notice inconsistencies. In some cases, men were listed as deceased without burial records. In others, names vanished from company employment rolls without ever appearing on death lists. These gaps were small individually, but together they formed a pattern difficult to dismiss. Stories began circulating about parts of the mine that were deliberately ignored during recovery. According to one account, a rescue team was ordered to turn back from a passage that appeared stable, with no explanation given. Another claims that a tunnel known informally as the lower drift was never entered after the first week, despite showing no visible damage. Historians later pointed out that the Darr mine disaster occurred at a moment when oversight was expanding but still incomplete. State agencies lacked authority to compel full disclosure. Companies controlled access. What they chose not to document effectively vanished. By the time the mine was fully abandoned, the opportunity to verify these claims had passed. Entrances were reinforced. Air shafts were blocked. The underground world that had swallowed so many men was sealed off permanently. The unanswered questions remained, not because no one asked them, but because there was nowhere left to look. As the Darr mine slipped further into the past, its story began to fragment into two parallel versions. One existed in official memory, a disaster explained, counted, and closed. The other survived quietly in local testimony, where certainty gave way to suspicion, and the absence of answers became part of the event itself. By 1910, coal companies in Pennsylvania were under increasing pressure to modernize safety practices. New regulations were proposed. Inspectors gained broader authority. Yet none of these reforms reached backward into the sealed depths of the Darr mine. What had been closed remained closed. What had been left unresolved stayed that way. Several historians who later attempted to reconstruct the disaster encountered immediate obstacles. Access to original company records was limited. Some files were missing entirely. Others had been condensed into summaries that omitted details deemed unnecessary at the time. One researcher noted that the more specific his questions became, the thinner the available documentation grew. Personal testimonies proved equally elusive. Survivors aged. Memories blurred. Some men refused to speak at all. Others told stories that shifted subtly each time they were repeated, not in substance but in emphasis. The same tunnel might be described as collapsed in one account and sealed in another. A sound remembered as an explosion by one miner became, in another telling, a sudden silence. What united these accounts was uncertainty. One former rescuer, interviewed years later, expressed frustration not at what he had seen, but at what he had not been allowed to see. He described being ordered to abandon a search route without explanation. "We were close," he said. "I don't know to what, but we were close." Local folklore absorbed these gaps. Stories emerged of untouched sections where tools still lay, of air pockets that could have sustained life longer than officials admitted. These stories were not told as ghost tales, but as unfinished work, tasks interrupted and never resumed. The Darr mine disaster became a reference point in mining history, cited for its death toll and its role in reform. Yet its most troubling feature was rarely mentioned, that no final, agreed-upon account of what happened underground ever emerged. Instead, the mine passed into a category of events that history acknowledges without fully understanding, a tragedy with numbers, and a silence with edges that no report ever managed to trace. As the second decade of the century approached, the Darr mine disaster began to harden into legend, not in the dramatic sense, but in the way unresolved events slowly detach from documentation and survive instead through repetition. The facts that could be confirmed remained fixed. The rest softened, shifted, and unsettled those who tried to hold them in place. Researchers reviewing coroner reports from Westmoreland County noticed an odd pattern. Several death certificates listed causes such as mine accident or gas exposure, yet lacked locations or times. A few were filed months after the disaster, as though the determination had been made long after the opportunity for confirmation had passed. In at least 2 cases, the certificates were amended years later without explanation. Company payroll records showed a similar ambiguity. Wages stopped abruptly for certain men, but no termination or death entry followed. It was as if their employment had ended without conclusion. These gaps were small enough to escape notice individually, but together, they suggested that not every disappearance had been formally accounted for. Local ministers who presided over memorial services recalled being given incomplete lists of names. One wrote privately that he suspected omissions but felt unable to challenge the company's authority. Funerals were held for men whose bodies had never been recovered. Empty coffins were lowered into the ground, symbolizing loss without certainty. By this point, the sealed sections of the mine were no longer simply unsafe. They were legally unreachable. Ownership disputes, liability concerns, and the cost of reopening made further exploration unlikely. What remained underground was, for all practical purposes, removed from history. Yet unease lingered. Farmers whose land sat above the abandoned tunnels continued to report subtle changes, ground settling unevenly, water appearing in new places, faint sounds that carried through the earth during certain seasons. These incidents were attributed to natural subsidence, but they kept the memory of the mine alive in ways official narratives could not suppress. What troubled later historians most was how quickly the disaster moved from investigation to acceptance. Not resolution, acceptance. The unanswered questions were absorbed into the background, treated as inevitable rather than exceptional. In this way, the Darr mine disaster became less a single event and more a boundary in time. Before it, optimism about industry and progress. After it, an awareness that some consequences could not be fully traced once buried deep enough. And somewhere beneath Westmoreland County, sealed behind rock and policy alike, the mine remained, holding a version of the story that never reached the surface. By the time official inquiries faded from public attention, the Darr mine had entered a quieter phase of its history, one shaped less by investigation and more by avoidance. The site was no longer worked. The machinery rusted. Warning signs replaced production schedules. What had once been a place of daily labor became a place people passed without stopping. Yet the disaster continued to surface in unexpected ways. County officials reviewing land deeds noticed that properties above the old tunnels were difficult to insure. Claims of subsidence appeared sporadically, often dismissed as routine for mining regions. Still, the language used in these reports echoed earlier uncertainties: unmapped voids, unknown depth, extent not fully determined. Former miners who had survived the disaster spoke rarely, but when they did, their accounts carried a common thread. They described the mine as changing in the final hours, not violently but subtly. Air that behaved differently, sound that did not travel as expected, a sense that the tunnels no longer matched memory. These details were often dismissed as trauma, yet they appeared too consistently to ignore. One retired inspector, interviewed years later, admitted that parts of the mine were never officially cataloged. "We knew there were places we couldn't account for," he said, "but knowing and proving are not the same thing." He explained that once entrances were sealed, the opportunity to verify conditions was effectively lost. Local newspapers occasionally revisited the disaster on anniversaries, but their coverage grew thinner over time. Early articles asked questions. Later ones repeated statistics. The missing names were rarely mentioned. Silence, it seemed, was easier to maintain than uncertainty. What remained unresolved was not merely how the disaster happened, but how much of it had been observed before recovery efforts stopped. The sealed tunnels represented a decision point, a moment when danger, cost, and liability outweighed the need for answers. And so the mine settled into the ground, its deepest sections untouched, its final moments undocumented. Above it, life continued. Children grew up. Fields were replanted. Roads were rerouted. But beneath it all, the Darr mine endured as an unfinished chapter, one shaped as much by what was left unexamined as by what was brought to light. As the years passed, the Darr mine disaster shifted from recent memory into historical reference. It appeared in textbooks and reports as a lesson in industrial risk, a catalyst for improved safety standards. Yet those summaries rarely lingered on the unresolved aspects. They listed numbers, dates, and reforms, but avoided the uneven edges of the story. Families of the missing noticed this omission first. As public attention moved on, their questions remained unanswered. Requests for clarification were met with the same responses issued years earlier. The mine had been searched to the extent possible. Conditions were unsafe. Further exploration was not justified. What those explanations did not address was why certain sections were never clearly defined as searched or sealed. Maps from different years continued to contradict one another. A tunnel labeled collapsed in one version appeared merely restricted in another. In some cases, entire passages vanished from later diagrams without explanation. Historians attempting to reconcile these inconsistencies found themselves limited by access. Company archives were incomplete. Government oversight files referenced documents that no longer existed. One researcher noted that the deeper his inquiry went, the more frequently he encountered phrases like information unavailable or records not preserved. Local oral histories filled some gaps, but introduced others. Stories varied, but many described the same unsettling idea: that parts of the mine were deliberately left unexplored, not because they were unreachable, but because acknowledging them would complicate the official narrative. One account described a sealed tunnel that remained structurally sound long after the disaster, its entrance reinforced rather than collapsed. Another recalled hearing discussions among supervisors about areas that did not need to be opened. These stories were never verified, but they persisted across generations. By the mid-1910s, the Darr mine existed almost entirely as absence. The physical site was overgrown. The underground passages were inaccessible. The men who had known its layout best were aging or gone. What remained were fragments, names without graves, maps without consistency, and a disaster whose final contours could no longer be traced with confidence. The mine had not merely closed. It had withdrawn from understanding. By the mid-1910s, the land above the Darr mine had changed enough that a visitor might not realize what lay beneath it. Trees reclaimed the slopes. Fences collapsed and were replaced. New families settled nearby, often unaware that the ground beneath their feet was threaded with passages no one could fully map anymore. Yet the mine was never entirely forgotten. County engineers reviewing infrastructure projects in the area occasionally flagged the land as unstable. Their notes referenced historic voids and unverified subsurface conditions. These warnings were vague, inherited language passed down from earlier assessments rather than the result of new inspections. No one reopened the mine to confirm them. Former miners who still lived in Westmoreland County spoke of the disaster with a restraint that felt deliberate. They did not embellish. They did not speculate wildly. Instead, they returned again and again to the same idea, that the mine became something different in its final moments. Not just dangerous, but unpredictable in ways they had not experienced before. One man described it simply: it stopped behaving like a mine. He explained that the usual signs, air flow, sound, vibration, no longer followed patterns miners relied on to stay alive. Directions felt unreliable. Distances seemed altered. When pressed for details, he would only say that the underground space felt confused. Such descriptions were easy to dismiss. Trauma distorts memory. Time reshapes experience. Yet the consistency of these accounts troubled those who studied them later. By this point, the sealed sections of the mine had become legally and physically unreachable. Ownership had changed hands. Liability had diffused. The cost of reopening far exceeded any practical benefit. What lay beyond the barriers was no longer part of any living system of accountability. And so the unanswered questions remained suspended in place, too deep to access, too uncertain to resolve, too costly to pursue. The Darr mine disaster, once an event, had become a condition. Not an ongoing danger, but a fixed absence in the historical record, shaped by decisions made under pressure and preserved by time. Above ground, life continued to reorganize itself. Below ground, the mine held its final version of the story, untouched, undocumented, and beyond reach. By the late 1910s, the Darr mine disaster had reached a strange kind of permanence. It was no longer debated in public forums, no longer investigated by officials, yet it had not faded from awareness either. Instead, it existed as a fixed point of uncertainty, an event acknowledged but never fully explained. Historians reviewing the period noted how quickly the narrative narrowed. Early reports had been complex and contradictory. Later summaries simplified the cause, reduced the questions, and emphasized the reforms that followed. In doing so, they created the impression of resolution without providing one. One mining historian wrote that the disaster became administratively complete long before it was historically complete. The sealed tunnels played a central role in this transformation. Once access was removed, inquiry stalled. No new evidence could emerge. Testimony lost urgency as years passed. Without physical verification, speculation hardened into assumption. Families of the missing adapted in different ways. Some accepted official explanations, finding closure where they could. Others held onto uncertainty, preserving details that never appeared in records, last letters, familiar work assignments, remembered locations underground. These fragments were passed down quietly, rarely shared beyond family circles. A few local researchers attempted to gather these accounts, but their efforts were limited. Memories conflicted. Documents were scarce. The mine itself remained inaccessible. What could not be confirmed could not be incorporated into formal history. What endured was a shared sense that the disaster's final shape had been decided by circumstance rather than understanding. The mine had dictated the limits of inquiry. Safety concerns, cost, and institutional pressure had closed the book before its final chapters could be read. In this way, the Darr mine disaster became emblematic of a broader pattern in industrial history, where events moved faster than systems designed to explain them, and where unresolved questions were sealed along with physical spaces. The mine no longer threatened lives, but it continued to withhold answers. As the disaster receded further into the past, the Darr mine began to occupy a different place in collective memory, not as an active mystery, but as a boundary beyond which inquiry no longer ventured. By the early 1920s, the mine was referenced primarily in historical summaries and safety lectures, its deeper complexities smoothed over by repetition. Yet even then, careful readers noticed what those summaries avoided. They cited casualty numbers without clarifying discrepancies. They referenced sealed tunnels without explaining why certain sections were never documented. They spoke of reform without revisiting the decisions that had curtailed recovery. A small group of academics studying industrial accidents attempted to revisit primary sources. Their work was hindered almost immediately. Company archives were incomplete. Government files referenced missing documents. Maps contradicted one another. One researcher remarked that the mine seemed to resist reconstruction, not physically, but administratively. Local memory proved equally resistant to clarity. Interviews with descendants produced fragments rather than narratives. A name remembered without a date. A tunnel recalled without a location. A story repeated with confidence but without confirmation. Each fragment hinted at a larger picture that could no longer be assembled. The land itself bore subtle traces of what lay beneath. Minor subsidence continued sporadically, reshaping fields and altering drainage patterns. Engineers attributed this to natural settling, yet the lack of detailed underground records made precise explanation impossible. What emerged was a sense that the mine had been removed from the normal cycle of historical understanding. Its final state was not one of danger or activity, but of closure enforced by uncertainty. The sealed sections were not merely inaccessible, they were excluded from explanation. In this way, the Darr mine disaster came to represent more than a single tragedy. It became an example of how industrial systems could absorb unresolved events by narrowing their scope, sealing their evidence, and allowing time to smooth their edges. The mine no longer demanded attention. It simply remained. By the mid-1920s, the Darr mine existed almost entirely as an outline in memory. Its name appeared in lists of historic disasters, its date fixed, its location known, but the internal shape of what had happened was gone. What remained was a framework built from conclusions rather than evidence. Occasionally, interest resurfaced. A journalist researching mining history requested access to the site in 1926. The request was denied on the grounds that the land was unsafe and privately held. No alternative documentation was offered. The journalist later wrote that the refusal itself felt like a continuation of the original response, firm, quiet, and final. Former miners who had worked Darr before the disaster were now elderly. A few gave interviews in which they spoke not of the explosion, but of the weeks before it. They described a mine that felt increasingly unstable, not structurally, but behaviorally. Ventilation patterns shifted. Sounds traveled unpredictably. Areas that had always been passable became difficult to navigate without obvious cause. None of these observations appeared in official records. What unsettled later historians was how consistently these men avoided speculation. They did not claim supernatural causes. They did not invent explanations. They simply described conditions that no longer matched experience, then stopped. By this time, the sealed tunnels had become permanent features of the landscape. There was no plan to reopen them, no incentive. The cost was too high, the risk unjustifiable, and the benefit uncertain. Whatever remained underground would remain there indefinitely. This finality reshaped how the disaster was understood. Without the possibility of new evidence, interpretation froze. The version of events that survived was the one that required the least explanation. Yet for those who studied the case closely, that version always felt incomplete, because a disaster of that scale did not simply end when the mine was sealed. It ended when inquiry stopped, and in the case of the Darr mine, inquiry had stopped early, under pressure, and without agreement. The silence that followed was not the result of resolution. It was the result of withdrawal. In the end, the Darr mine disaster settled into history without ever surrendering its final shape. It became a fact rather than a question, dated, numbered, and cited, while the deeper uncertainties remained sealed beneath layers of rock and decision. The mine did not reveal everything it took, and no authority ever compelled it to. What lingers is not a single unanswered question, but a pattern. The pattern of records that thin where certainty should increase, of maps that disagree where precision mattered most, of names that appear, then vanish, without the closure of recovery or confirmation. The pattern of a place where danger, cost, and institutional pressure converged, an inquiry yielded before understanding. In Westmoreland County, the land above the mine bears no monument large enough to match the scale of what lies beneath. Fields and roads pass over spaces that were never fully explored, never fully explained. Those who know the history speak carefully, aware that the mine's silence is not empty, it is complete. The Darr mine disaster is remembered as one of the deadliest in American history. That much is certain. What is less certain is how many stories ended underground, uncounted by the final tallies. How many answers were sealed because opening them would have required time, risk, and accountability that no one was prepared to bear. Some mysteries persist because evidence is lost. Others persist because evidence was set aside. The mine remains closed. The tunnels remain dark. And the questions that could not be pursued when they were closest now sit beyond reach, preserved not by secrecy alone, but by the passage of time. In Pennsylvania, in the winter of 1907, a mine went silent. And in the quiet that followed, not everything came back to the surface.